The Vietnam War, 1 November 1955 30 April 1975, was an armed conflict in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia fought between North Vietnam, Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and South Vietnam, Republic of Vietnam, and their allies. North Vietnam was supported by the Soviet Union and China, while South Vietnam was supported by the United States and other anti-communist nations. The conflict was the second of the Indochina Wars and a proxy war of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and U.S. The Vietnam War was one of the post-colonial wars of national liberation, a theater in the Cold War, and a civil war, with civil warfare a defining feature from the outset. 47. Direct U.S. military involvement escalated from 1965 until its withdrawal in 1973. The fighting spilled into the Laotian and Cambodian civil wars, which ended with all three countries becoming communist in 1975. After the defeat of the French Union in the First Indochina War that began in 1946, Vietnam gained independence in the 1954 Geneva Conference, but was divided in two at the 17th parallel. The Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, took control of North Vietnam, while the U.S. assumed financial and military support for South Vietnam, led by Ngo Dinh Diem. A8. The North Vietnamese supplied and directed the Viet Cong VC, a common front of dissidents in the South which intensified a guerrilla war from 1957. In 1958, North Vietnam invaded Laos, establishing the Ho Chi Minh Trail to supply the VC. By 1963, the North had covertly sent 40,000 soldiers of its People's Army of Vietnam, PAVN, armed with Soviet and Chinese weapons, to fight in the insurgency in the South. President John F. Kennedy increased U.S. involvement from 900 military advisors in 1960 to 16,000 in 1963, and sent more aid to the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, which failed to produce results. In 1963, Diem was killed in a U.S.-backed military coup, which added to the South's instability. Following the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, the U.S. Congress passed a resolution that gave President Lyndon B. Johnson authority to increase military presence without declaring war. Johnson launched a bombing campaign of the North and sent combat troops, dramatically increasing deployment to 184,000 by 1966 and 536,000 by 1969. U.S. forces relied on air supremacy and overwhelming firepower to conduct search and destroy operations in rural areas. In 1968, North Vietnam launched the Tet Offensive, which was a tactical defeat, but convinced many Americans the war could not be won. Johnson's successor, Richard Nixon, began Vietnamization from 1969, which saw the conflict fought by an expanded ARVN while U.S. forces withdrew. The 1970 Cambodian coup d'etat resulted in a PAVN invasion and U.S. ARVN counterinvasion, escalating its civil war. U.S. troops had mostly withdrawn from Vietnam by 1972, and the 1973 Paris Peace Accords saw the rest leave. The accords were subsequently violated by North Vietnam, and fighting continued until the 1975 Spring Offensive and fall of Saigon to the PAVN, marking the war's end. North and South Vietnam were reunified in 1976. The war exacted an enormous cost. Estimates of Vietnamese soldiers and civilians killed range from 970,000 to 3 million. Some 275,000 310,000 Cambodians, 20,000 000 Laotians, and 58,220 U.S. service members died. A7. Its end would precipitate the Vietnamese boat people and the larger Indochina refugee crisis, which saw millions leave Indochina, of which about 250,000 perished at sea. 55-56. 20% of South Vietnam's jungle was sprayed with toxic herbicides, which led to significant health problems. 57. 144-145-58. the Khmer Rouge carried out the Cambodian genocide, and the Cambodian-Vietnamese War began in 1978. In response, China invaded Vietnam, with border conflicts lasting until 1991. Within the U.S., the war gave rise to Vietnam Syndrome, an aversion to American overseas military involvement, 59, which, with the Watergate scandal, contributed to the crisis of confidence that affected the United States throughout the 1970s-60. Names. Various names have been applied and shifted over time, though Vietnam War is the most commonly used in English. It has been called the Second Indochina War since it spread to Laos and Cambodia, 61 the Vietnam Conflict, 62-63, and colloquially Nam. In Vietnam it is known as Cong Chi letter 1 EBF, and Ch letter 1 ED1NG, M letter 1 EF9 lit. Resistance War against America, 64-65. The government of Vietnam officially refers to it as the Resistance War against America to save the nation, 66. Background. Main articles: French Indochina, Vietnamese nationalism and communism in Vietnam. Vietnam had been under French control as part of French Indochina since the 1880s. Vietnamese independence movements, such as the Vietnamese Nationalist Party, faced suppression despite growing public support for diverse reformist and revolutionary nationalist causes. 67-68. Nguyen Sinh Cung established the Indochinese Communist Party, ICP, in 1930. The Marxist, Leninist Party aimed to overthrow French rule and establish a communist state. 69. Fractures between nationalists and communists emerged in the late 1920s, as the two groups differed in their visions for post-colonial Vietnam. Republicanism for the Revolutionary Nationalists, 71, and Proletarian Internationalism for the Communists, 72. The communist radical push for centralized control led to a prolonged civil conflict marked by the suppression of rival nationalists, 73, with the ICP largely responsible for initiating systemic Vietnamese-on-Vietnamese violence. 74. 515. Japanese occupation of Indochina. Main articles: French Indochina in World War II and 1940-1946 in French Indochina. Viet Minh flag, which later became the flag of North Vietnam, prototype of the national flag of contemporary Vietnam. In September 1940, Japan invaded French Indochina, following France's capitulation to Nazi Germany. By 1941, Japan had gained full military access across Indochina and established a dual colonial rule that preserved Vichy French administration while facilitating Japanese military operations. 75. Kung, now known as Ho Chi Minh, returned from exile to establish the anti-Japanese Viet Minh movement. 69. From 1944. The U.S. Office of Strategic Services, OSS, provided the Viet Minh with weapons and training to fight the occupying Japanese. 76-77. U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt supported Vietnamese resistance and proposed Vietnam's independence be granted under an international trusteeship after the war. 78. The Viet Minh secured their advantage by relocating their operations from southern China into Vietnam and leveraging Allied support. 79. In March 1945, Japan, losing the war, overthrew the French government in Indochina, established the Empire of Vietnam, and maintained Emperor B letter 1EA3 OD letter 1EA1I as a figurehead. 80. The nationalist sentiment that had intensified during World War II paradoxically laid the groundwork for the communist-led Viet Minh, themselves cloaked in nationalism. 81. 64-65, following the surrender of Japan, they launched the August Revolution, overthrowing the Japanese-backed state and seizing weapons from the Japanese. On 2 September, Ho Chi Minh declared the independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, DRV. However, British and French forces arrived in Indochina to oversee the Japanese surrender south of the 16th parallel, while Chinese nationalist troops did so in the north. On September 23, the British supported a French coup that overthrew the DRV government in Saigon and reinstated French control. 82-83, OSS forces withdrew as the French sought to reassert control in southern Indochina. First Indochina War. Main articles: Civil conflicts in Vietnam, 1945–1949, War in southern Vietnam, 1945–1946, and First Indochina War. B. Letter 1EA3 OD/Letter 1EA1I, right. As the Supreme Advisor to the government of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, led by President Ho Chi Minh, left, September 1945. Beginning in August 1945, the Viet Minh sought to consolidate power by terrorizing and purging rival Vietnamese nationalist groups and Trotskyist activists. 8480, 580, 687. 383-441. In 1946, the Franco-Chinese and Ho Saint-Denis agreements facilitated a coexistence between the DRV and French that strengthened the Viet Minh while undermining the nationalists. 88-89. That summer, the Viet Minh colluded with French forces to eliminate nationalists, targeted for their ardent anti-colonialism. 90-84. 205-207-91. 175, 177-92, 699-700. With most of the nationalist partisans defeated, 93-94, and negotiations broken down, tensions between the Viet Minh and French authorities erupted into full-scale war in December 1946-95, a conflict that would later become entangled with the Cold War. Surviving nationalist partisans and politic-religious groups rallied behind the exiled B. Letter 1EA3 OD/Letter 1EA1I to reopen negotiations with France in opposition to communist domination. 96-91. 187-188. While the state of Vietnam, under B. Letter 1EA3 OD/Letter 1EA1I as Chief of State, aligned with the anti-communist Western Bloc, the French exploited it to extend their colonial presence and to bolster their standing within NATO. 97. By adhering to Marxist, Leninist principles, Vietnamese communists monopolized power through a series of radical campaigns. 98-99-100. The anti-communist Truman Doctrine, first announced by President Harry S. Truman in March 1947, pledged United States support to nations resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. 101. In Indochina, this policy was first put into practice when in February 1950 the U.S. recognized the French-backed state of Vietnam, based in Saigon, as the legitimate government. After Communist China and the Soviet Union recognized the Democratic Republic of Vietnam the month prior. 102, 377-379-23. 88. The outbreak of the Korean War in June convinced Washington policymakers that the war in Indochina was another example of communist expansionism, directed by the Soviet Union. 23. 33-35. Within the United States, the Red Scare and rise of McCarthyism fostered public opposition to communism and convinced Americans that communist ideology needed to be quelled wherever possible. 103. Military advisors from China began assisting the Viet Minh in July 1950. 104. 14 Chinese weapons, expertise, and laborers transformed the Viet Minh from a guerrilla force into an army. 23, 26-105. In September 1950, the U.S. created the Military Assistance Advisory Group, MAAG, to screen French aid requests, advise on strategy, and train Vietnamese soldiers. 106. 18. By 1954, the U.S. had spent $1 billion in support of the French effort, shouldering 80% of the war costs. 23:35. Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Main articles: Battle of Dien Bien Phu and Operation Vulture. During the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, U.S. carriers sailed to the Gulf of Tonkin, and the U.S. conducted reconnaissance flights. France and the U.S. discussed the use of tactical nuclear weapons, though how seriously this was considered and by whom is unclear. 173. 75. According to then Vice President Richard Nixon, the Joint Chiefs of Staff drew up plans to use nuclear weapons to support the French. 107. Nixon, a so-called hawk, suggested the U.S. might have to put American boys in. 6. 76. President Dwight D. Eisenhower made American participation contingent on British support, but they were opposed. 6. 76. Eisenhower, wary of involving the U.S. in an Asian land war, decided against intervention. 23. 75. 76. U.S. intelligence estimates remained skeptical of France's chance of success. 108. In May 1954, the French garrison at Dien Bien Phu surrendered. This marked the end of French military involvement in Indochina. At the Geneva Conference, they negotiated a ceasefire with the Viet Minh, and the independence of Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam was affirmed, with Vietnam placed under a temporary North-South division. 109-110. Transition period. Main articles: 1954 Geneva Conference, 1954 in Vietnam, Operation Passage to Freedom, and Land Reform in North Vietnam. The 1954 Geneva Conference. At the 1954 Geneva Conference, Vietnam was temporarily partitioned at the 17th parallel. Ho Chi Minh wished to continue war in the South, but was restrained by Chinese allies, who convinced him he could win control by electoral means. 111-23. 87-88 civilians were allowed to move freely between the two states for 300 days. Elections were to be held in 1956 to establish a unified government. 23. 88-90. However, the U.S., represented at the conference by Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, objected to the resolution. Dulles' objection was supported only by the representative of B letter 1EA3 OD stroke letter 1EA1I, 77, John Foster's brother, Allen Dulles, who was director of the Central Intelligence Agency, then initiated a psychological warfare campaign which exaggerated anti-Catholic sentiment among the Viet Minh and distributed propaganda attributed to Viet Minh threatening an American attack on Hanoi with atomic bombs. 77-112-23. 96-97. The CIA's efforts played a minimal role, as Catholic migrants were driven primarily by their own convictions and circumstances rather than external psychological operations. 113. During 300 days, up to 1 million Northerners, fearing persecution by the Communists, moved south. 23. 96-114, including at least 500,000 Catholics, approximately 200,000 Buddhists, and tens of thousands from ethnic minority communities. 115. The exodus was coordinated by a U.S.-funded $93 million relocation program, which involved the French Navy and U.S. 7th Fleet to ferry refugees. 116. The refugees gave the later Ngo Dinh Di letter 1EC7M regime a strong anti-communist constituency. 117. Over 100,000 Viet Minh fighters went north for regroupment, expecting to return south within 2 years. 57. 98. The Viet Minh left roughly 5,000 to 10,000 cadres in the south as a base for insurgency. 23. 104. The last French soldiers left South Vietnam in 1956. 23. 116. And China withdrew from North Vietnam. 104. 14. Anti-B letter 1EA30D stroke letter 1EA1I revolutionists of the state of Vietnam at City Hall, Saigon, May 1955. Between 1953 and 1956, the Northern government instituted agrarian reforms, including rent reduction and land reform, which resulted in political oppression. During land reform, North Vietnamese witnesses suggested a ratio of one execution for every 160 village residents, about 100,000 executions. As the campaign was mainly in the Red River Delta, 50,000 executions became accepted by scholars: 118, 143, 119, 120, 569, 121. However, documents from Vietnamese and Hungarian archives indicate executions were much lower, though likely greater than 14,000. 122 in 1956, leaders in Hanoi admitted to excesses and restored much of the land to the original owners. 23, 99, 100. The South, meanwhile, constituted the state of Vietnam, with B letter 1EA3 OD stroke letter 1EA1I as emperor, and Ngo Dinh Di letter 1EC7M as prime minister. Neither the U.S. nor DI letter 1EC7M state of Vietnam signed anything at the Geneva Conference. The non-communist Vietnamese delegation objected to any division of Vietnam, but lost when the French accepted the proposal of Viet Minh delegate PH letter 1EA1M Van D stroke letter 183 NG. 123. 134, who proposed Vietnam be united by elections under the supervision of local commissions. 123. 119, the U.S. countered with the American plan, with the support of South Vietnam and the U.K. 123. 140, it provided for unification elections under UN supervision, but was rejected by the Soviets. 123. 140, the U.S. said. With respect to the statement made by the representative of the state of Vietnam, the United States reiterates its traditional position that peoples are entitled to determine their own future, and that it will not join in any arrangement which would hinder this. 123. 570-571, Eisenhower wrote in 1954. I have never talked or corresponded with a person knowledgeable in Indochinese affairs who did not agree that had elections been held as of the time of the fighting, possibly 80% of the population would have voted for the communist Ho Chi Minh as their leader rather than chief of state B letter 1EA3 OD stroke letter 1EA1I. Indeed, the lack of leadership and drive on the part of B letter 1EA3 OD stroke letter 1EA1I was a factor in the feeling prevalent among Vietnamese that they had nothing to fight for. 124. Ba Cut, commander of the Hoa H letter 1EA3 O religious movement, in Can Tho Military Court 1956. According to the Pentagon Papers, D.I. letter 1EC7M would have been a more popular candidate than B letter 1EA3 OD stroke letter 1EA1I against H letter 1ED3. Stating. It is almost certain that by 1956 the proportion which might have voted for Ho in a free election against Diem would have been much smaller than 80%. 125. In 1957, independent observers from India, Poland, and Canada, representing the International Control Commission, ICC, stated that fair elections were impossible, reporting that neither South nor North had honored the armistice agreement. 126. From April to June 1955, D.I. letter 1EC7M eliminated political opposition in the South by launching operations against religious groups. The Cao Dai and Hoa H letter 1EA30 of Ba C letter 1E5T. The campaign attacked the Bin Xiern organized crime group, which was allied with members of the Communist Party secret police and had military elements. The group was defeated in April following a battle in Saigon. As broad opposition to his harsh tactics mounted, D.I. letter 1EC7M sought to blame the Communists. 6. In a referendum on the future of the state of Vietnam in October 1955, D.I. letter 1EC7M rigged the polls supervised by his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu, and was credited with 98%, including 133% in Saigon. His American advisors had recommended a more modest winning margin of 60–70%. DI Letter 1EC7M, however, viewed the election as a test of authority. 127. He declared South Vietnam to be an independent state under the name Republic of Vietnam, ROV, with him as president. 23. Likewise, Ho Chi Minh and other communists won 99% of the vote in North Vietnamese elections. 118. 193, 194, 202, 203, 215, 217. The domino theory, which argued that if a country fell to communism, surrounding countries would follow, was first proposed by the Eisenhower administration. 102. 19. John F. Kennedy, then a senator, said, Burma, Thailand, India, Japan, the Philippines, and obviously Laos and Cambodia are among those whose security would be threatened if the red tide of communism overflowed into Vietnam. 128. DI Letter 1EC7M Era, 1954–63. Main articles: Ngo Dinh Diem and War in Vietnam, 1954–1959. Rule: U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower and Secretary of State John Foster Dulles greet President Ngo Dinh Diem, Letter 1EC7M of South Vietnam in Washington. 8 May 1957. A devout Catholic, DI Letter 1EC7M was fervently anti-communist, nationalist, and socially conservative. DI Letter 1EC7M represented narrow and extremist nationalism coupled with autocracy and nepotism. 102–200–200. Most Vietnamese were Buddhist, and alarmed by DI Letter 1EC7M's actions, like his dedication of the country to the Virgin Mary. In 1955, 129, DI Letter 1EC7M launched the Denounce the Communists campaign, during which suspected communists and other anti-government elements were imprisoned, tortured, or executed. He instituted the death penalty in 1956 against activity deemed communist. 51. The North Vietnamese government claimed that, by November 1957, over 65,000 were imprisoned and 2,148 killed. 130. 40,000 political prisoners were jailed by 1959–57. 89. In October 1956, DI Letter 1EC7M launched a land reform program limiting the size of rice farms per owner. 1.8 acres of farm land became available for purchase by landless people. By 1960, the process had stalled because many of Diem's biggest supporters were large landowners. 131, 1416. In May 1957, DI Letter 1EC7M undertook a 10-day state visit to the U.S. Eisenhower pledged his continued support, and a parade was held in DI Letter 1EC7M's honor. But Secretary of State Dulles privately conceded DI Letter 1EC7M had to be backed because they could find no better alternative. 132. Insurgency in the South, 1954–60. Main articles: Viet Cong and War in Vietnam, 1959–1963. Between 1954 and 1957, the DI Letter 1EC7M government succeeded in preventing large-scale unrest in the countryside. In April 1957, insurgents launched an assassination campaign, referred to as extermination of traitors. 133. 17 people were killed in the Chow D-Stroke Letter 1ED1C massacre at a bar in July. 51. By early 1959, DI Letter 1EC7M had come to regard the violence as an organized campaign and implemented Law 1059, which made political violence punishable by death. 134. There had been division among former Viet Minh, whose main goal was to hold elections promised in the Geneva Accords, leading to activities separate from the other communists and anti-GVN government of the Republic of Vietnam activists. Douglas Pike estimated that insurgents carried out 2,000 abductions and 1,700 assassinations of officials, village chiefs, hospital workers, and teachers from 1957 to 1960. 23. 10651. Violence between insurgents and government forces increased from 180 clashes in January 1960 to 545 in September, 135. In September 1960, COSVN, North Vietnam's southern headquarters, ordered a coordinated uprising in South Vietnam, and a third of the population was soon living in areas of communist control. 23. 106-107. In December, North Vietnam formally created the Viet Cong (VC) with the intent of uniting all anti-GVN insurgents, including non-communists. It was formed in Memot, Cambodia, and directed through COSVN. 104. 55-58. The VC placed emphasis on the withdrawal of American advisors and influence, on land reform and liberalization of the GVN, on coalition government and the neutralization of Vietnam. Identities of the leaders were often kept secret. 51. Support for the VC was driven by resentment of Diem's reversal of Viet Minh land reforms. The Viet Minh had confiscated large private landholdings, reduced rents and debts, and leased communal lands to poorer peasants. Diem brought the landlords back, and people who had been farming land for years had to return it and pay years of back rent. The divisions within villages reproduced those that had existed against the French. 75% support for the NLF clarification needed, 20% trying to remain neutral, and 5% firmly pro-government. 136. 73. North Vietnamese involvement. See also, North Vietnamese invasion of Laos and Ho Chi Minh Trail. In March 1956, Southern Communist leader Lair Du Letter 1EA9 N presented a plan to revive the insurgency entitled The Road to the South to the Politburo in Hanoi. However, as China and the Soviets opposed confrontation, his plan was rejected. 104. 58. Despite this, the North Vietnamese leadership approved tentative measures to revive southern insurgency in December. 50 communist forces were under a single command structure set up in 1958. 137. In May 1958, North Vietnamese forces seized the transportation hub at Thi Chepon in southern Laos near the demilitarized zone between North and South Vietnam. 138. 24. The North Vietnamese Communist Party approved a People's War on the South in January 1959. 23. 119-120, and in May, Group 559 was established to upgrade the Ho Chi Minh Trail, then a 6-month mountain trek through Laos. On 28 July, North Vietnamese and Pathet Lao forces invaded Laos, fighting the Royal Lao Army along the border. 139. 26. About 500 of the regroupees of 1954 were sent south on the trail during its first year of operation. 140. The first arms delivery was completed in August 1959. 141. In April 1960, North Vietnam imposed military conscription for men. About 40,000 communist soldiers infiltrated the South between 1961 and 1963. 104. 76. Kennedy's escalation, 1961-63. Main articles: War in Vietnam, 1959-1963, and Strategic Hamlet Program. President Kennedy's news conference of 23 March, 1961. In the 1960 U.S. presidential election, John F. Kennedy defeated Richard Nixon. Although Eisenhower warned Kennedy about Laos and Vietnam, Europe and Latin America loomed larger than Asia on his sights. 142. Kennedy remained committed to the Cold War foreign policy, inherited from the Truman and Eisenhower administrations. In 1961, the U.S. had 50,000 troops based in South Korea, and Kennedy faced four crisis situations. The failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion he had approved in April 143, settlement negotiations between the pro-Western government of Laos and the Pathet Lao Communist movement in May 144, construction of the Berlin Wall in August, and the Cuban Missile Crisis in October. Kennedy believed another failure to stop communist expansion would irreparably damage U.S. credibility. He was determined to draw a line in the sand and prevent a communist victory in Vietnam. He told the New York Times after the Vienna summit with Khrushchev, "Now we have a problem making our power credible, and Vietnam looks like the place." 146. Kennedy's policy toward South Vietnam assumed DI-1EC7M, and his forces had to defeat the guerrillas on their own. He was against the deployment of American combat troops and observed, to introduce U.S. forces in large numbers there today, while it might have an initially favorable military impact, would almost certainly lead to adverse political and, in the long run, adverse military consequences. 147. The quality of the South Vietnamese military, however, remained poor. Poor leadership, corruption, and political promotions weakened the ARVN. The frequency of guerrilla attacks rose as the insurgency gathered steam. While Hanoi's support for the VC played a role, South Vietnamese governmental incompetence was at the core of the crisis. 102. 369. President Kennedy meeting with Secretary of Defense McNamara in June 1962. A major issue Kennedy raised was whether the Soviet space and missile programs had surpassed those of the U.S. Although Kennedy stressed long-range missile parity with the Soviets, he was interested in using special forces for counterinsurgency warfare in Third World countries threatened by communist insurgencies. Although they were intended for use behind front lines after a conventional Soviet invasion of Europe, Kennedy believed guerrilla tactics employed by special forces would be effective in a brush-fire war in Vietnam. Kennedy advisors Maxwell Taylor and Walt Rostow recommended U.S. troops be sent to South Vietnam disguised as flood relief workers. 148. Kennedy rejected the idea but increased military assistance. In April 1962, John Kenneth Galbraith warned Kennedy of the danger we shall replace the French as a colonial force, and bleed as the French did. 149. Eisenhower put 900 advisors in Vietnam, and by November 1963, Kennedy had put 16,000,23. 131. The Strategic Hamlet Program was initiated in late 1961. This joint U.S. South Vietnamese program attempted to resettle the rural population into fortified villages. It was implemented in early 1962 and involved forced relocation and segregation of rural South Vietnamese into new communities where the peasantry would be isolated from the VC. It was hoped these new communities would provide security for the peasants and strengthen the tie between them and central government. However, by November 1963, the program had waned, and it ended in 1964-6. 1070. In July 1962, 14 nations, including China, South Vietnam, the Soviet Union, North Vietnam, and the U.S., signed the International Agreement on the Neutrality of Laos. The inept performance of the ARVN was exemplified by failed actions such as the Battle of Ap Bac in January 1963, in which the VC won a battle against a much larger and better-equipped South Vietnamese force, many of whose officers seemed reluctant to engage. 150. 201-206. The ARVN lost 83 soldiers and 5 U.S. helicopters, serving to ferry troops shot down by VC forces, while the VC lost only 18 soldiers. The ARVN forces were led by DI-1EC7M's most trusted general, HU letter 1EF3, and H. Van Cao. Cao was a Catholic, promoted due to religion and fidelity rather than skill, and his main role was to preserve his forces to stave off coups. Washington policymaker concluded D.I. letter 1EC7M was incapable of defeating the communists and might even make a deal with Ho Chi Minh. He seemed concerned only with fending off coups and had become paranoid after attempts in 1960 and 1962, which he partly attributed to U.S. encouragement. Robert F. Kennedy noted, D.I. letter 1EC7M wouldn't make even the slightest concessions. He was difficult to reason with. 151 historian James Gibson summed up the situation. Strategic hamlets had failed. The South Vietnamese regime was incapable of winning the peasantry because of its class base among landlords. Indeed, there was no longer a regime, in the sense of a relatively stable political alliance and functioning bureaucracy. Instead, civil government and military operations had virtually ceased. The National Liberation Front had made great progress and was close to declaring provisional revolutionary governments in large areas. 152. Discontent with D.I. letter 1EC7M's policies exploded in May 1963, following the HU letter 1EBF PH letter 1EADT D-stroke letter 1EA3N shootings of 9 Buddhists protesting the ban on displaying the Buddhist flag on Vesak. This resulted in mass protests, the Buddhist crisis, against discriminatory policies that gave privileges to Catholics over the Buddhist majority. Ngo Dinh Th letter 1E5C, D.I. letter 1EC7M's elder brother and the Archbishop of HU letter 1EBF, held his anniversary celebrations shortly before Vesak. They were bankrolled by the government, and Catholic flags were prominently displayed. D.I. letter 1EC7M refused to make concessions to the Buddhists or take responsibility for the deaths. In August 1963, the ARVN Special Forces of Colonel Lair Quang Tung, loyal to D.I. letter 1EC7M's brother Ngo Dinh Nhu, raided pagodas, causing destruction and hundreds of deaths. The Republic of Vietnam sought to harness religious nationalism by promoting spiritual values in opposition to communism's atheism. This approach amplified religious consciousness that challenged the state's authority. 153. ARVN forces capture Viet Cong. U.S. officials began discussing regime change during 1963. The United States Department of State wanted to encourage a coup, while the Pentagon favored D.I. letter 1EC7M. Chief among the proposed changes was removal of D.I. letter 1EC7M's brother Nhu, who controlled the secret police and special forces, and was seen as being behind Buddhist repression and the Ngo family's rule. This proposal was conveyed to the U.S. Embassy in Saigon in Cable 243. The CIA contacted generals planning to remove D.I. letter 1EC7M and told them the U.S. would not oppose this, nor punish them by cutting off aid. D.I. letter 1EC7M was overthrown and executed, along with his brother, on 2 November 1963. When Kennedy was informed, Maxwell Taylor remembered he rushed from the room with a look of shock and dismay on his face. 154. Kennedy had not anticipated D.I. letter 1EC7M's murder. The U.S. Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge invited coup leaders to the embassy and congratulated them. Lodge informed Kennedy that the prospects now are for a shorter war. 155. Kennedy wrote to Lodge congratulating him for a fine job. 156. Following the coup, chaos ensued. Hanoi took advantage and increased its support for the VC. South Vietnam entered political instability as one military government toppled another. Each new regime was viewed by the communists as a puppet of the Americans. Whatever the failings of D.I. letter 1EC7M, his credentials as a nationalist had been impeccable. 102. 328 U.S. advisors were embedded in the South Vietnamese armed forces. They were criticized for ignoring the political nature of the insurgency. 157. the Kennedy administration sought to refocus U.S. efforts on pacification, which in this case was defined as countering the insurgency 158-159 and winning the hearts and minds of the population. Military leadership in Washington, however, was hostile to any role for U.S. advisors other than troop. General Paul Harkins, the commander of U.S. forces in South Vietnam, confidently predicted victory by Christmas 1963. 106. 103. The CIA was less optimistic, warning that the Viet Cong by and large retain de facto control of much of the countryside and have steadily increased the overall intensity of the effort. 161. Paramilitary officers from the CIA's Special Activities Division trained and led Hmong tribesmen in Laos and into Vietnam. The indigenous forces were in the tens of thousands and conducted direct action missions, led by paramilitary officers, against the Communist Pathet Lao forces and their North Vietnamese supporters. 162. The CIA ran the Phoenix program and participated in the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, MACV-SOG. 163. Gulf of Tonkin and Johnson's escalation, 1963-69. Main article, Joint Warfare in South Vietnam, 1963-1969. Further information, United States in the Vietnam War section Americanization, January 1964, South Vietnamese coup, September 1964, South Vietnamese coup attempt, December 1964 South Vietnamese coup, and 1965 South Vietnamese coup. Kennedy was assassinated on 22 November 1963. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson had not been heavily involved with policy toward Vietnam, 164A9, however he immediately focused on it. On 24 November he said, "The battle against communism must be joined with strength and determination." 166. Johnson knew he had inherited a deteriorating situation, 167, but adhered to the widely accepted domino argument for defending the South. Should they retreat or appease, either action would imperil other nations. 168. Findings from Rand's Viet Cong motivation and morale project bolstered his confidence that an air war would weaken the insurgency. Some argue the policy of North Vietnam was not to topple other non-communist governments in Southeast Asia. 102. 48. The Military Revolutionary Council, meeting in lieu of a strong South Vietnamese leader, had 12 members. It was headed by General Duong Van Minh, whom journalist Stanley Carno recalled as a model of lethargy. 169. Lodge cabled home about Minh. Will he be strong enough to get on top of things? Minh's regime was overthrown in January 1964 by General Nguy Letter 1EC5 N Con. 170. There was persistent instability in the military. Several coups, not all successful, occurred in a short period of time. Gulf of Tonkin Incident. Main article, Gulf of Tonkin Incident. Further information, credibility gap. A U.S. B-66 destroyer and 4 F-105 Thunder Chiefs dropping bombs on North Vietnam during Operation Rolling Thunder. On 2 August 1964, USS Maddox, on an intelligence mission along North Vietnam's coast, fired upon and damaged torpedo boats approaching it in the Gulf of Tonkin. 57. 124. A second attack was reported 2 days later on USS Turner Joy and Maddox. The circumstances were murky. 23. 218-219 Johnson commented to Undersecretary of State George Ball that those sailors out there may have been shooting at flying fish. 171. An NSA publication declassified in 2005 revealed there was no attack on 4 August. 172. The second attack led to retaliatory airstrikes and prompted Congress to approve the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution on 7 August. 173, 222-244. This granted the president power to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression, and Johnson relied on this as giving him authority to expand the war. 23. 221. Johnson pledged he was not committing American boys to fighting a war that I think ought to be fought by the boys of Asia to help protect their own land. 23. 227. The National Security Council recommended an escalation of the bombing of North Vietnam. Following an attack on a U.S. Army base in February 1965, 174 airstrikes were initiated, while Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin was on a state visit to North Vietnam. Operation Rolling Thunder and Operation Arclight expanded aerial bombardment and ground support operations. 175. The bombing campaign, which lasted 3 years, was intended to force North Vietnam to cease support for the VC by threatening to destroy North Vietnamese air defenses and infrastructure. It was additionally aimed at bolstering South Vietnamese morale. 176. Between 1965 and 1968. Rolling Thunder deluged the North with 1 million tons of missiles, rockets, and bombs. 177. Bombing of Laos. Main article: Laotian Civil War. Bombing was not restricted to North Vietnam. Aerial campaigns targeted different parts of the VC and PAVN infrastructure. These included the Ho Chi Minh Trail through Laos and Cambodia. The ostensibly neutral Laos had become the scene of a civil war, pitting the Laotian government backed by the U.S. against the Pathet Lao and its North Vietnamese allies. Aerial bombardment against the Pathet Lao and PAVN forces was undertaken by the U.S. to prevent the collapse of the government and deny use of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Between 1964 and 1973, the U.S. dropped 2 million tons of bombs on Laos, similar to the 2.1 million tons of bombs it dropped on Europe and Asia during World War II, making Laos the most heavily bombed country in history. 178. The objective of stopping North Vietnam and the VC was never reached. The Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force Curtis LeMay, however, had long advocated saturation bombing in Vietnam and wrote of the communists that were going to bomb them back into the Stone Age. 23. 328. The 1964 offensive. ARVN forces and a U.S. advisor inspect a downed helicopter. Battle of Dong Xoai, June 1965. Following the Tonkin Resolution, Hanoi anticipated the arrival of U.S. troops and expanded the VC, as well as sending PAVN personnel southwards. They were outfitting the VC forces and standardizing their equipment with AK-47 rifles and other supplies, as well as forming the 9th Division. 23. 223-179. From a strength of approximately 5,000 at the start of 1959, the Viet Cong's ranks grew to about 100,000 at the end of 1964. Between 1960–160, for the Army's strength rose from about 850,000 to nearly 1 million men. 157 U.S. troop numbers deployed were much lower, 2,000 in 1961, rising to 16,500 in 1964. 180. The use of captured equipment decreased, while more ammunition and supplies were required to maintain regular units. Group 559 was tasked with expanding the Ho Chi Minh Trail in light of U.S. bombardment. The war had shifted into the final, conventional phase of Hanoi's 3-stage protracted warfare model. The VC was tasked with destroying the ARVN and capturing and holding areas. However, it was not yet strong enough to assault towns and cities. In December 1964, ARVN forces suffered losses at the Battle of Bin Gia, 181, in a battle both sides viewed as a watershed. Previously, the VC had utilized hit-and-run guerrilla tactics. At Bin Gia, they defeated a strong ARVN force in a conventional battle and remained in the field for 4 days. 182:58 Tellingly, South Vietnamese forces were again defeated in June 1965 at the Battle of Destrokletter 183 in Gizai. 182:94 American Ground War. See also Buddhist Uprising. A Marine from 1st Battalion, 3rd Marines, moves a suspected Viet Cong during a search and clear operation held by the battalion 15 miles, 24 km, west of Da Nang Air Base, 1965. On 8 March 1965, 3,500 U.S. Marines were landed near Da Nang, South Vietnam. 23. 246-247. This marked the beginning of America's ground war. U.S. public opinion overwhelmingly supported the deployment. 183. The Marines' initial assignment was defense of Da Nang Air Base. The first deployment was increased to nearly 200,000 by December. 102. 349-351. U.S. military had been schooled in offensive warfare. Regardless of policy, U.S. commanders were institutionally and psychologically unsuited to defensive missions. 102. 349-351. General William Westmoreland informed Admiral U.S. Grant Sharp, Jr., commander of U.S. Pacific Forces, that the situation was critical. 102. 349-351. I am convinced that U.S. troops with their energy, mobility, and firepower can successfully take the fight to the NLF, Viet Cong. 184. With this recommendation, Westmoreland advocated an aggressive departure from America's defensive posture and sidelining of the South Vietnamese. By ignoring ARVN units, the U.S. commitment became open-ended. 102. 353. Westmoreland outlined a 3-point plan to win. Phase 1. Commitment of U.S. and Allied forces necessary to halt the losing trend by the end of 1965. Phase 2. U.S. and Allied forces mount major offensive actions to seize the initiative to destroy guerrilla and organized enemy forces. This phase would end when the enemy had been worn down and driven back from major populated areas. Phase 3. If the enemy persisted, a period of 12-18 months following Phase 2 would be required for final destruction of forces remaining in remote base areas. 185. The plan was approved by Johnson and marked a profound departure from the insistence that South Vietnam was responsible for defeating the VC. Westmoreland predicted victory by December 1967. 186. Johnson did not communicate this change to the media. Instead, he emphasized continuity. 187. The change in policy depended on matching the North Vietnamese and VC in a contest of attrition and morale. The opponents were locked in an escalation cycle. 102. 353-354. However, Johnson ruled out invasion of North Vietnam due to fears of Chinese or Soviet intervention. 188. Westmoreland and McNamara touted the body count system for gauging victory, a metric that proved flawed. 189. Peasants suspected of being Viet Cong under detention of U.S. Army. 1966. The American buildup transformed the South Vietnamese economy and profoundly affected society. South Vietnam was inundated with manufactured goods. Washington encouraged its SEATO allies to contribute troops. Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, and the Philippines 190 agreed. South Korea asked to join the Many Flags program in return for economic compensation. Major allies, however, notably Canada and the UK, declined troop requests. 191. The U.S. and allies mounted complex search and destroy operations. In November 1965, the U.S. engaged in its first major battle with the PAVN, the Battle of Ia Drang. 192. The operation was the first large-scale helicopter air assault by the U.S., and first to employ Boeing B-52 Stratofortress bombers. 23. 284-285, these tactics continued in 1966-67. However, the PAVN-VC insurgents remained elusive and demonstrated tactical flexibility. By 1967, the war had generated large-scale internal refugees, 2 million in South Vietnam, with 125,000 people evacuated and rendered homeless during Operation Masher, the largest search and destroy operation to that point. Operation Masher had negligible impact, however, as the PAVN-VC returned to the province just 4 months afterwards. 194. 153-156, despite major operations, which the VC and PAVN would evade, the war was characterized by smaller unit engagements. 195. The VC and PAVN would initiate 90% of large firefights, and thus the PAVN-VC would retain strategic initiative despite overwhelming U.S. force and firepower deployment. 195. The PAVN and Viet Cong had developed strategies capable of countering U.S. doctrines and tactics. See NLF and PAVN battle tactics. Meanwhile, South Vietnamese politics began to stabilize with the arrival of Prime Minister Air Marshal Nguy Letter 1EC5 and Cao K Letter 1EF3 and figurehead Chief of State General Nguy Letter 1EC5 and Van Thi Letter 1EC7U in mid-1965. In 1967, Thieu became president with Kai as his deputy after rigged elections. Though nominally a civilian government, K-Letter 1EF3 was supposed to maintain real power through a behind-the-scenes military body. However, THI Letter 1EC7 U outmaneuvered and sidelined K-Letter 1EF3. THI Letter 1EC7 U was accused of murdering K-Letter 1EF3 loyalists through contrived military accidents. THI Letter 1EC7 U remained president until 1975, having won a one-candidate election in 1971. 196. Johnson employed a policy of minimum candor. 197 with the media. Military information officers sought to manage coverage by emphasizing stories that portrayed progress. This damaged public trust in official pronouncements. As coverage of the war and the Pentagon diverged, a credibility gap developed. 197. Despite Johnson and Westmoreland proclaiming victory and Westmoreland stating the end is coming into view. 198. Internal reports in the Pentagon Papers indicate VC forces retained strategic initiative and controlled their losses. VC attacks against static U.S. positions accounted for 30% of engagements, VC-PAVN ambushes and encirclements for 23%, American ambushes against VC-PAVN forces for 9%, and American forces attacking VC emplacements only